Welcome to another of our series of conversations. This is part 2 of our discussion with Dr. Larry Crabb. If you haven't had a chance to see part 1, I hope you'll get a chance to do that also on the website. And just briefly again, Larry is the co-founder of what he calls the larger story. We're going to get into that in a much more detail in this session. He's also the founder of New Way Ministries. He's one of our most popular faculty members at christianuniversity.org, or Our Daily Bread University, in his series on soul care, which we talked about in more detail in part 1 of this. His PhD is in clinical psychology from the University of Illinois. So we're happy to have you with us. Welcome, Larry.
It's good being with you, Evan, as always.
I wanted to chat with you a little bit about, I'm intrigued by this issue of helping people understand what the larger story and the smaller story of their life is. But to do that, let's present this as a case study. I'd like to present an actual conversation that I had, and I actually made a note on it to just have you tell how you would address this person as it relates to the larger story and the smaller story in their lives. Now, we realize people don't know what that is or define it yet, and I'm sure you'll get to that. But it's part of what we call a meaningful conversation. This person says, I'm disillusioned with God to the point that I'm ready to walk away from my faith. If there is a God at all, he isn't working for me. Hopelessness is probably an understatement with how I feel. Tough conversation to start with. Larry, help us help that person through that.
You're expecting me to know how to talk to that person, are you?
I do recall some of the conversations we've had. You've said early on, you said someone would bring a issue like that and you'd say, oh my goodness, this person needs professional help.
I wish that weren't true, but when I was in private practice for 10 years, I really have to say that there were many, many times that somebody was sharing such difficult things that my mind went to, this person needs professional help. And here I'm a licensed PhD clinical psychologist and didn't have a clue what to do at the moment. And I don't think that's because of poor training. I think that's because the reality is that life is confusing and we really don't know where to go sometimes, apart from having some broad categories of understanding that Christianity provides. So as you're telling me about a guy that is saying, I'm just disillusioned, the Christianity means nothing to me, I'm not even sure if God exists, and I've never felt more hopeless in my life. When that person shares that, the very first thing that I would resist as a conversationalist is trying to do anything that might be helpful. Because if you're trying to help them, you're putting pressure on them. And the other thing I would tell you not to do, and if people hear this, they're going to throw stones at me, but let me explain what I mean. Don't start by praying out loud. Because that's going to off-put the person. I've already said I don't believe in God. What's the point of your talking to him? So rather than trying to somehow fix the thing, rather than feeling threatened by a guy that has rejected God, how about being intrigued by that? How about wondering, this is really very sad, very difficult. I believe there is a God. I'd love to see this guy come to know the Lord in a way that apparently he'd never known him. I'd like him to understand that sin's a big issue in our lives and he's totally forgiven. And all those things have to be in your mind, but just don't push it. Don't force it right away. Be with the person. Step number 1. I hate using steps here, but the first thought that comes to your mind, I want to be with, I don't want to fix. I'm not going to quote a Bible verse that should do it. I'm not going to utter a prayer that should change his life. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to want to know this person out of curiosity. But then secondly, the idea of exploring, what I would want to be very intrigued. I would probably ask something like, is this something that you've been disillusioned about since you were a kid? I wonder when this disillusionment really started. Now if that sounds like I'm trying to be a psychoanalyst, that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm simply wanting to realize that a man of understanding is going to probe into the deep waters of a person's life. And that's in the book of Proverbs where he talks about that. So I'm going to want to be able to explore what were the triggers for that? Because there's always a trigger for things. We all come into this world with an anti-God virus. That's what J.I. Packer calls our flesh. And something triggered that natural enmity to God that everybody has. And I don't know what it was. Maybe this guy was molested by a Boy Scout leader. Maybe this guy had, like, I remember one guy that I met who was saying pretty much the same thing. And when I asked him, I said, "Where did this begin?" He said, "Well, I can tell you where it began." And he said that with that kind of anger. He said, "It was about 15 years ago. My favorite aunt, the godliest woman I've ever known, meant the world to me when I was teaching the Bible. I was an elder in my church. And then she got brain cancer. And I prayed without stopping that God would heal her, and she died. And I thought, if that's the kind of God that's up there, I want nothing to do with him whatsoever." And that led into a conversation. If I'd have simply said, "Oh, but you got to know Jesus loves you. You've got to know that the Bible's true. And let me tell you how wonderful he is to me." Don't go there. Explore. And I would just want to know, tell me where this started. Tell me what has really disillusioned you the most. And what is it like to be a guy that's so disillusioned? And do understand, as I'm talking to this guy, there have been struggles, ups and downs in my life where I've struggled with disillusionment, probably not to your level, maybe to your level, I don't know. But either way, it just interests me that you've really kind of given up on God, and there's got to be something going on there. And I just love to know what that is. And I think that's the second thing that I would do.
Mhm.
But then, as long with this explore, discover, I think as I explore what's going on beneath the surface in this guy's life, where it all started, why he's so disillusioned, I would want to know what does it feel like to be as hopeless as you are? And and I think what I'd be expecting to discover if you explore something like that, what is it like to feel this hopeless? When you go to bed at night, are you able to sleep? Do you just kind of run it out of your mind and just say, "Oh, what the dickens, I'm just going to go to bed, take a sleeping pill, and I'll get a decent breakfast, and I'll be all right"? If that's what's going on, I'd love to hear about it. But is there, as I open-endedly ask, what's it like to feel so hopeless and disillusioned? I know, because I know this person bears the image of a relational God, that there's going to be some thirst, some longing in his soul for something that's different than what he's experiencing now. And my mind goes to Psalm 42, where I'm thirsty for God, for the living God, as a deer pants after water. I'm thirsty for God. That's in the soul of everybody. That was in the soul of Adolf Hitler, which got obviously completely submerged. That's in the soul of Hugh Hefner, which obviously got sidetracked in terrible directions. But it's in everybody's heart. And if I can understand, if I can get a glimpse at least of maybe saying, "Well, I really kind of feel lonely, and yeah, it's hard being hopeless." Why would it be so hard being hopeless? If there
Mhm.
really is no God, then you're the one that's smart. You're the one that ought to be hopeless, and then you got to figure out life. But it sounds like you're asking for more, something more alive in you than than the hopelessness, and just leading into that. Um, and you see where it goes. It might go nowhere, or it might go wonderfully. You just never know. That's not up to me. It's up to the Spirit. But then to actually touch the person with saying, it's been an incredible privilege of hearing where you are in all this, because I know that's an incredible struggle, and it sounds like you're really longing for something that isn't there, and that's got to be a hard place to be. And maybe all I can share with you at this point is I really do believe there is a God, and I believe that that what he's up to, what I think he's centrally committed to, is touching the deepest desire in our soul with something that provides long-term satisfaction. And I know you're longing for something, and I think what I'm talking about is where you are, and that may not interest you at all in the moment, or it may at some point later. And I'd love to have the conversation continue if you had a chance some other time. And that would be just a quick little summary of the direction it might go. And one thing, when I used to supervise people in therapy or counseling, one of the things that I think I was very aware of is I can't supervise well because nobody, not a therapist, not the best trained therapist in the world, the most discerning Christian, nobody is going to be able to anticipate exactly what's going to happen in the middle of a conversation. And so you've got to be able to roll with whatever it is. And then the way to roll with that is to have some categories of understanding, some ways of thinking that can guide a conversation. And that's where these four words we're talking about, know, explore, discover, and touch, can be guiding things. And just to eliminate those words as the central issue, but to realize I'm really talking to an image bearer that does have longings. And even though he doesn't believe there's a God and wants no part of him, that's not the deepest part of his soul. There's something beneath his anger at God. There's something beneath his frustration. And I want to be curious about that. I want to explore the fact that there is a thirst for something, maybe not a thirst for God right now. He wouldn't put it that way, but it's there. And you've just got to roll with the conversation with these categories in your mind. Again, not demanding that anything happen that you want, praying that good things will happen, but demanding nothing, because it's a spirit's job, not yours, to bring this person back to himself.
So in that process, were you moving this person from focusing on the smaller story of their life and trying to whet their appetite for what would be the larger story?
I think that's a very fair way of putting it. Let me tell you what I think about that. When I think of the smaller story, I think of my story when I was born. My story began at, when I was conceived. Obviously, I believe that the human life began at conception. But when I think of my smaller story, I think about the day I was born, and my smaller story is going to end the day I die. Now, if all I'm thinking about is life lived in between my birth and my death, then it's going to be unavoidable that I'm going to be trying to make this life work best in terms of my satisfaction, because I have nothing in the future to look forward to. It's all about the few years I have in this life, maybe 60, 70, 80, whatever number of years it is, maybe 20 or 30. But if the entire panorama of my life is in between my birth and my death, my self-centeredness, my natural self-centeredness is going to come to the fore as my deepest desire. I want things to go well for me. But if you think about the larger story, and Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 4, he has a very strange sentence. I want you to gaze on what you can't see. I mean, Paul, that doesn't make any sense on the surface of it. But what he's saying is there's a larger story that's unfolding, and I want you to think about that. And I put this in two categories. And I'm looking at this guy whose life is hopeless and he doesn't have anything going for him at all. I'm thinking there is a story that began in eternity past. That's a long time ago. We can't discuss what that was, but a long time ago, when the Trinity made a decision to make people and start a story going. And this story is going to continue into eternity future. Now, that's the larger story. But then the way we pick up on the larger story is in between the cross and the coming. That's not between my birth and my death, but it's in between what happened on the cross 2,000 years ago and what's going to be true when the Lord returns. So when I'm looking at this guy, thinking about a smaller story, all I'm thinking about nothing more. If I'm a smaller story thinking, I'm thinking about nothing more than getting this guy to adjust better to the mess that he's in. And maybe, I don't know, maybe sinful things would help. Maybe pornography would get his mind off his troubles. Maybe smoking pot would help. Or maybe just being a nice guy and being nice to his neighbors and avoiding all the obvious sin issues, but just being a decent guy and maybe feel a little better and work a little harder maybe and go out and give himself a little comfort, buy a new car or whatever. All you're doing is getting smaller story counsel, and that just goes nowhere. It just feeds narcissism, feeds self-centeredness. But in the larger story, you're thinking about very, very different categories. You're thinking about what can go on in the soul of a person that bears the image of God, that is here to move into the kingdom that has already begun and is going to continue in between the person of Christ on his death, when something miraculous happened there, and something that's going to happen very different when the coming comes. There's going to be no more crying, no more tears, no more anything bad, Revelation 21:5 tells us. And if you think in those larger story categories, it's just going to be a very different experience as you're interacting with somebody. And I'll tell you one more point about that. I remember when I was teaching this, and the larger story concept was brand new in my mind some years ago. And I was teaching a master's program in counseling, and we were talking about anorexia. And we were talking about the dynamics going on in anorexics and the control issues and trauma issues and all those typical things that psychologists talk about. But at one point I said, I don't think you're going to be a Christian counselor. You're not going to be having a larger story conversation as long as your focus is on getting this young girl to eat more. That really isn't the central issue. Of course you want her to eat more. If she's anorexic, she's hurting her body. She needs to have a more responsible approach to eating. But that grows out of living in the larger story. Focus on that as the direct route to changing this person's heart, to seeing this person's heart changed to the point where all the dynamics that are keeping her from eating can be dislodged by the dynamics of the spirit once she's living in the larger story of God's. You got to be thinking in those categories when you're dealing with people. You're not fixing the smaller story. You're enlarging the story to live in something much grander than many of us can even understand.
That's a great, as you mentioned, could categories of thinking of what we're trying to accomplish with that and not trying to fix. Well, as you were speaking, and this just brought back to mind, I remember a little statement that stuck with me from way back in my high school days. In fact, I
Hmm.
was at this point still in junior high. And you remember in those, there would always be the yearbook. And my older brother, they always asked each person to give one statement for their life that would they would want people to remember. And I remember looking at his yearbook when I was in junior high, and his statement was this: live life in view of eternity.
Ah,
And it seems that what you're talking about, I've always remembered that, is to think when times of suffering, when times of difficulty come around, there is living life in view of eternity is really living life in the larger story. True?
yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
simple phrase that has deep, deep meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I think of from 2 Corinthians 4:16 and 17. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day, for light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is seen is eternal. And I see so many of these people there, and I imagine in your counseling that so many of the times that issue that you say prompts this is often a time of suffering or difficulty or something that says, how can I believe in a God who X, who did X? The larger story seems to present a very different view of those times of pain and suffering.
And if I didn't believe in the larger story, meaning if I didn't believe that there is an incredible past originated by the Trinity of love, the God of love, an incredible future that's going to consummate in everything my soul desires, if I didn't believe in that, I don't see how I could continue being a Christian.
Mm,
I really don't understand it because in the smaller story, I don't see God doing a lot of what I wish he would do. I still have cancer. I would really like him to cure me, and he could, and he's not doing it. Now, might he tomorrow? I'll be happy if he does, and I'll go out and celebrate with a steak dinner. But if he doesn't, do I still have heaven to look forward to? Am I demanding God cooperate with my agenda for my smaller story? And that's all I'm left with. And when he doesn't cooperate, why bother believing in him? He's not worth
mm,
anything.
mm,
And a lot of Christians come up with saying, I know God is good, but what good is he?
mm.
And in the smaller story, I don't know if there's a good answer to that.
We have this vision of eternity. I remember as a kid thinking forever and ever and ever and
Hmm.
ever and ever, and thinking, wow, that's a long time. And from my perception, that was like being in a continual session of church with hymn singing and my bottom hurting and wanting to go out and play and do other things. But I think even as adults, we may not have a real perception of what that eternity with the presence of God may be like.
Well, long story short, I spent 33 days in the hospital, and I've never had a holier, more joyful experience in my life than those 33 days in the hospital.
Wow.
I can't tell you the steps that I took to get there. All I can tell you is this: it's not to my credit.